From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
Under Secretary Kemp, more people have lost the right to vote in the state of Georgia. They've been purged, they've been suppressed, and they've been scared.
In this farce about voter suppression and people being held up from being on the rolls and being able to vote is absolutely not true.
Georgia Secretary of State Brian Kemp and Democrat Stacey Abrams spar in their first gubernatorial debate in Georgia. Amidst growing accusations, Kemp's overseeing widespread voter suppression in an attempt to prevent Abrams from becoming the nation's first female African-American governor. Newly leaked audio shows Kemp telling Republican donors he's concerned too many Georgians would exercise their right to vote. We'll speak to Harvard Kennedy professor Leah Wright-Reger and investigative journalist Greg Palast, then to Dodge City, Kansas, where authorities have moved the city's only polling location outside the city limits to an area not accessible by public transport. The city is 60% Latino. Then, who's behind ICE? We look at how Amazon, Microsoft, and Palantir, among other big tech firms, are profiting from detention and deportations.
Introducing Amazon Recognition Video, the easy-to-use API for deep learning-based analysis to detect, track, and analyze people and objects in video. Amazon Recognition Video uses the visual, what, temporal, when, and motion from the video to deliver high-quality person tracking and detection of activities like running, playing soccer, or getting into a car.
As Amazon pushes ICE to buy its facial recognition software to track immigrants, we'll speak with Jacinta Gonzalez, an organizer with Mi Gente. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Half the population of Yemen could soon face famine. That's according to the United Nations aid chief, Mark Lowcock. He says the unfolding humanitarian catastrophe is, quote, much bigger than anything any professional in this field has seen during their working lives. The number of Yemenis facing famine has been updated to 14 million based on recent analysis. This is Lowcock.
Beyond the sheer numbers, while millions of people have been surviving on emergency food assistance for years, the help they get is enough merely to survive, not to thrive. The toll is unbearably high. The immune system of millions of people on survival support for years on end are now literally collapsing, making them, especially children and the elderly, more likely to succumb to malnutrition, cholera, and other diseases.
The ongoing U.S.-backed Saudi-led bombing of Yemen has come under renewed scrutiny in the wake of the Saudi murder of journalist Jamal Khashoggi. German Chancellor Angela Merkel has said she will halt arms exports to Saudi Arabia, but other leaders have yet to follow. Amnesty International has urged French President Emmanuel Macron to halt arms sales to the Saudis, while Prime Minister Justin Trudeau faces similar pressure in Canada. Trudeau has said he's unlikely to cancel a 2014 deal with the Saudis for the sale of armored vehicles. President Trump has said he will not halt weapons sales to Saudi Arabia. President Trump spoke out Tuesday on journalist Jamal Khashoggi's murder, calling it the worst cover-up ever.
They had a very bad original concept. It was carried out poorly, and the cover-up was one of the worst in the history of cover-ups. It's very simple. Bad deal, should have never been thought of. Somebody really messed up.
On Tuesday, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo announced the U.S. will revoke the visas of Saudi operatives accused of participating in Khashoggi's killing. Pompeo went on to reaffirm the U.S. shared strategic interests with Saudi Arabia, echoing Trump's statements about Saudi Arabia as a strong ally to the United States. Meanwhile, Turkish investigators have reportedly found several suitcases, a laptop, and clothing that may be linked to the murder in a car belonging to the Saudi consulate. On Tuesday, Sky News reported parts of Khashoggi's dismembered body were found in the garden of the Saudi Consul General's Istanbul home, though the reports remain unconfirmed. This comes as a Reuters report into Saud al-Qahtani, a top aide for Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince, claims he directed Khashoggi's killing remotely via Skype, instructing those in carrying out Khashoggi's interrogation and murder to, quote, bring me the head of the dog. Meanwhile, in Riyadh, the Saudi royal family met with Jamal Khashoggi's family, including his son, releasing photos of the highly publicized event to the press. Salah Khashoggi appeared visibly strained as he shook the crown prince's hand. Jamal Khashoggi's children are banned from leaving Saudi Arabia. Elsewhere in Riyadh, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman received a standing ovation Tuesday as he made a surprise appearance at the opening of the Saudi Investors Forum, dubbed Davos in the Desert. The Crown Prince is due to make his first public remarks since Khashoggi's death at the conference today. As the summit got underway, officials said the state-owned oil company, Saudi Aramco, had signed 15 agreements with foreign investors, including 6 with U.S. companies worth $34 billion. An unnamed financial services executive from the East Coast of the U.S. who attended the conference told the Washington Post, quote, it's unfortunate, obviously, and we hope the regime will listen and change, but they do things their own way here. In Russia, U.S. National Security Advisor John Bolton said Tuesday the Trump administration is holding firm to its plan to withdraw the U.S. from the 1987 Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, or INF. Bolton made the remarks after meeting in Moscow with Russian President Vladimir Putin.
In terms of filing the formal notice of withdrawal, that has not been filed. It'll be filed in due course.
Bolton's remarks came a day after President Trump said he hopes to expand the nuclear arsenal. The U.S. already has an estimated 6,800 nuclear warheads. In election news, the controversy over voter suppression in Georgia took center stage Tuesday as audio of Georgia Secretary of State and Republican gubernatorial candidate Brian Kemp was leaked just hours before his debate with Democratic opponent Stacey Abrams, who hopes to become the first African-American woman governor in the country. In the recording taken at a campaign event last week and published by Rolling Stone, Kemp expressed concern over Georgians exercising their right to vote, particularly in early and absentee voting.
And as worried as we were going into the start of early voting with the literally tens of millions of dollars that they are putting behind to get out the vote efforts for their base, a lot of that with absentee ballot requests. They have just an unprecedented number of that, which is something that continues to concern us, especially if everybody uses and exercises their right to vote, which they absolutely can, and mails those ballots in. We got to have heavy turnout to offset that.
At Tuesday's debate, the Georgia Secretary of State, gubernatorial candidate Brian Kemp, accused Stacey Abrams of encouraging undocumented people to vote illegally. Abrams responded, Kemp has used Georgia's strict exact match voter ID law to put thousands of voter applications on hold.
Under Secretary Kemp, more people have lost the right to vote in the state of Georgia. They've been purged, they've been suppressed, and they've been scared. This is a man who had someone arrested for helping her blind father cast a ballot. He raided the offices of organizations to stop them from registering voters. That type of voter suppression feeds the narrative, because voter suppression isn't only about blocking the vote. It's also about creating an atmosphere of fear, making people worry that their votes won't count.
We'll have more on Georgia and the upcoming midterm elections later in the broadcast. In Iraq, a car bomb blast outside a market in a northern town near Mosul killed at least 6 people and wounded 30 others. No group has claimed responsibility, but Iraqi forces claimed ISIS was behind the attack. In France, police removed close to 2,000 refugees out of the Grand Saint camp in the northern city of Dunkirk. The camp has become a central hub for migrants attempting to reach the UK after the nearby Calais refugee camp, known as the Jungle, was demolished in 2016. Grand Saint was built as a joint effort between the mayor of Grand Saint and Doctors Without Borders, but it's become a political flashpoint in France, and authorities have attempted to evict camp residents several times already this year. President Trump lashed out again Tuesday at the Central American migrant caravan making its way across Mexico toward the U.S. border, claiming Middle Eastern terrorists had infiltrated the group. Pressed by a reporter, Trump admitted he had no proof to back his claim.
They say it happens all the time from the Middle East. It's not even saying bad or good, but some real bad ones. But they intercept, well, they could very well be.
But there's no proof.
There's no proof of anything. There's no proof of anything. But they could very well be.
There's no proof of anything, the president said. Vice President Mike Pence claimed Honduran President Juan Orlando Hernandez had spoken to him about the caravan.
He told me that the caravan that's now making its way through Mexico, headed for the southern border, was organized by leftist organizations and financed by Venezuela.
Later in the broadcast, we'll go to Phoenix, Arizona, to speak with immigrant rights organizer Jacinta Gonzalez about a shocking new report detailing how companies like Amazon, Palantir, and Microsoft are profiting from and expediting Trump's deportation operations. President Trump falsely accused Puerto Rico of using hurricane relief funds to pay off debts, tweeting, "The U.S. will not bail out long outstanding and unpaid obligations with hurricane relief money." The tweet came as the federally appointed Financial Oversight Board, PROMESA, approved a revised fiscal reform plan which calls for cuts in government spending and is projecting that over $80 billion in anticipated federal disaster funds will help rebuild the Puerto Rican economy. In fact, elected officials in Puerto Rico have not advocated using relief funds to pay off debt. Governor Ricardo Rosselló opposed the newly unveiled plan, saying, quote, "Money will be available to bondholders, but to the detriment of the most vulnerable in our people. This is simply unfair," he said. At a Houston, Texas campaign rally for Republican Senator Ted Cruz Monday evening, President Trump declared that he's a nationalist.
A globalist is a person that wants the globe to do well, frankly, not caring about our country so much. And you know what? We can't have that. You know, they have a word. It sort of became old-fashioned. It's called a nationalist. And I say, really, we're not supposed to use that word. You know what I am? I'm a nationalist, okay? I'm a nationalist.
Trump's comments Monday align with his populist America First rhetoric through the label of nationalists is more often associated with extreme right-wing ideology and fascist regimes. Questioned by reporters Tuesday, Trump denied the term nationalist was used to describe racist movements, saying he was proud to use it and that it, quote, should be brought back. The wife of white supremacist leader Richard Spencer has accused him of regularly physically and emotionally abusing her during a marriage, according to divorce filings. Nina Kuprianova alleges being hit, being grabbed, being dragged around by her hair, being held in a manner causing bruising, and being prevented from calling for help, unquote. Additionally, the filings claim Spencer's racist public statements have made his family, including his 2 young children, the targets of violence. Spencer, who is credited with coining the term alt-right, has attracted violence following many of his speeches and was a featured speaker at the deadly Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville in 2017. In New York City, 5 of the 9 members of the far-right group Proud Boys have been arrested on rioting and assault charges. The arrests follow the October 12th street attack in which dozens of members of the group were caught on camera physically assaulting anti-fascist protesters after attending a talk by their leader, Gavin McInnes, at the nearby Metropolitan Republican Club. The New York Police Department was sharply criticized following the attack for failing to arrest anyone at the time. In Brazil, right-wing presidential frontrunner Jair Bolsonaro is leading handily in the polls ahead of his weekend's election as civil society groups are warning against a dangerous turn toward authoritarian rule. Reporters Without Borders is warning against ongoing attacks on press freedom, including threats against reporter Patricia Campos Melo, who wrote the widely circulated story claiming pro-Bolsonaro business leaders are funding an online smear campaign against his opponent, Fernando Haddad. Meanwhile, video has surfaced of Jair Bolsonaro's son, Eduardo, threatening to shut down the Supreme Court if his father doesn't win the upcoming elections. And former Brazilian political prisoners are calling out Bolsonaro's frequent praise for Brazil's former military dictatorship and his defense of notorious torture chief Carlos Alberto Brilhante Ustra, who died without ever being tried for his crimes. This is former political prisoner Gilberto Natalini.
So I think whoever defends Ustra, Bolsonaro himself, Bolsonaro knows who Ustra was. He knows. He has an authoritarian tendency, which is a tendency that, in my opinion, borders on savagery when he defends torture. Bolsonaro knows. He is not a useful idiot. However, a lot of Brazilians who are voting for him, they support him because of a reaction against the Workers' Party. So we're stuck between something bad and something worse.
And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Mimi Goodman.
And I'm Juan Gonzalez. Welcome to all of our viewers and listeners across the country and around the world. With the midterm elections less than 2 weeks away, we begin today's show looking at the governor's race in Georgia, where Democrat Stacey Abrams is attempting to become the first black woman governor in the country. Polls show Abrams and her opponent, Georgia Secretary of State Brian Kemp, are in a dead heat. But the race has been roiled with accusations that Kemp has used his power as Secretary of State to suppress the vote. Earlier this month, Abrams called Kemp to step down as Secretary of State for placing 53,000 voter applications on hold. 7 out of 10 of the stalled applications are for African-American voters in a state where less than 1/3 of the population is black. Voting rights activists have also sued Kemp for purging voters from the rolls.
On Tuesday, Rolling Stone published an audio recording of Kemp privately telling Republican donors he's concerned about too many Georgians exercising their right to vote. Listen carefully.
And as worried as we were going into the start of early voting with the literally tens of millions of dollars that they are putting behind to get out the vote efforts for their base, a lot of that with absentee ballot requests. They have just an unprecedented number of that, which is something that continues to concern us, especially if everybody uses and exercises their right to vote, which they absolutely can, and mails those ballots in. We got to have heavy turnout to offset that.
Georgia Republican gubernatorial candidate Brian Kemp speaking last Friday at an event in Atlanta for Republican donors. Audio of his remarks were leaked to Rolling Stone magazine. Well, on Tuesday night, Brian Kemp and Stacey Abrams faced off in their first debate.
And this farce about voter suppression and people being held up from being on the rolls and being able to vote is absolutely not true. Anyone who meets the requirements that's on the pending list, all they have to do is do the same thing that you and I at home have to do. Go to your polling location, show your government ID, and you can vote. But 75% of those individuals missed the Social Security match, which is a federal problem.
Ms. Abrams, would you like to respond?
I would indeed. The right to vote is a right. I grew up in a family that fought for the right to vote before they were old enough to do so. My father was arrested helping people register, and so I take the right to vote very seriously. I only believe that those who have the legal eligibility to vote should cast a ballot. But I also understand that under Secretary Kemp, more people have lost the right to vote in the state of Georgia. They've been purged, they've been suppressed, and they've been scared. This is a man who had someone arrested for helping her blind father cast a ballot. He raided the offices of organizations to stop them from registering voters. That type of voter suppression feeds the narrative, because voter suppression isn't only about blocking the vote. It's also about creating an atmosphere of fear, making people worry that their votes won't count. As the next governor of Georgia, I will work with the Secretary of State to ensure that there is no question that the right to vote in Georgia is not a privilege. It is indeed a right that belongs to those who are Georgia citizens, and I will work hard to make it so.
That's Georgia Democratic governor candidate Stacey Abrams debating the Republican Secretary of State, a gubernatorial candidate Brian Kemp. To talk more about what's at stake in the race, we're joined by Leah Wright-Rigueur, professor at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government, author of The Loneliness of the Black Republican, Pragmatic Politics and the Pursuit of Power. So you saw the debate last night, Professor Rigueur. Can you talk about what was raised and start with this issue of voter suppression, the accusation that Brian Kemp is holding on to 53,000 voter registration forms and also that leaked audio recording questioning Georgians' right to vote?
Stacey Abrams versus Brian Kemp has become a touchstone for the entire country and for issues of voter rights and thinking about what does voting mean, who has the right to vote, voter suppression, questions of, alleged questions of voter fraud. And we saw that play out on the debate stage last night where, you had Brian Kemp saying the idea of voter suppression is a farce versus Stacey Abrams, who very clearly and explicitly said, no, actually, voting is a right. It is a constitutional right. It is a protected right. And this election is all about ensuring the rights of people to ensure that democracy is actually exists as opposed to just imagined. So really, that's what that was at the heart of the debate last night. And really played out as these two contenders took very polarizing and very opposite opinions on a very contentious issue.
Professor Leah Wright-Rigueur, I'd like to ask you about the Rolling Stone release of the audio of Kemp talking to some donors about his concern about too many people voting.
Absolutely. I mean, this is not actually a new concern. The Republicans for a very long time have had very open conversations, in other cases, very private conversations about their concern about turnout. And why is that? Because the higher the turnout, particularly amongst groups of color, particularly amongst young people, tends to favor Democratic candidates. In this case, Stacey Abrams has really taken, what shouldn't be a novel approach, but is a novel approach, by going out and pounding the pavement and going after non-likely, unlikely voters, voters who haven't voted before, young people, people of color, getting them to try and turn out at high numbers. And so if you're Brian Kemp, that is something that you absolutely don't want. And so in his private remarks, this is essentially what he said, which is, we don't want these people coming out and voting. We have to think about what are the alternatives and how can we not get them to come out, even though that's their legal and constitutional right to vote.
We're going to go to break and then come back to this discussion. We'll also bring in Greg Palast, who is suing the Secretary of State Kemp. Leah Wright-Rigueur is going to stay with us, professor at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. We'll also be asking her about the video that's just come out of Stacey Abrams decades ago participating in a flag burning of the Confederate flag of Georgia at the time that led to the flag being replaced, gotten rid of. This is Democracy Now! Stay with us. Natural skin deep. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
As we continue to look at voter suppression in Georgia, a new investigation has found that the Georgia Secretary of State and Republican gubernatorial candidate Brian Kemp has overseen the removal of more than 340,000 current Georgia residents from voting rolls. In a moment, we will be joined by journalist Greg Palast. But first, I want to turn to part of a new video he produced about the voter purge in Georgia.
How did Kemp wipe out the registrations of 550,000 voters? He used the postcard trick. Kemp sent out millions of these cards, requiring voters to confirm their addresses. Problem? They look like junk mail. 8 out of 10 voters who get them throw them away. Throw away the card, and Kemp can throw you off the rolls. The trick? Not everyone gets a postcard. Mostly, they go to neighborhoods like this.
This is my neighborhood, and this is where I almost got purged.
Stacy Hopkins is a community organizer.
Give me a hug. Give me a hug, baby. This is also a community that's rapidly changing. It impacts us as a voting community. With all these empty houses, our vote is being lost. Our political power is being lost.
When Kemp sent her a postcard, he picked the wrong target.
I look at these mailers that are telling me and 2 of my children that if we did not fill out these forms and return them, we were going to be moved to the inactive list, but we had just voted. I decided to try and hold Mr. Kemp accountable for that because I wanted to know why he didn't want me to vote. We filed suit against Secretary of State Kemp.
And she won, big time.
159,000 were restored to the voting rolls, and that was a good feeling.
But what feels bad is that more than 500,000 voters remain on the purge list. We had to threaten Kemp with a federal lawsuit, but he finally gave up the names of every voter he purged. Then we made all the names public. I was flooded with 1,900 emails from Georgians stunned they had lost their right to vote.
Investigative journalist Greg Palast attempted to question Georgia Secretary of State, the Republican gubernatorial candidate Brian Kemp, about the purge.
Mr. Kemp, are you removing black voters from the voter rolls just so you can win this election? Why are you purging voters from the voter rolls? Sir, why aren't you answering my questions? Sir, why do we have to sue you to get the names of voters who've been removed? Why are you... Let go of me right now, sir. Okay, is there any other reporter being thrown out here?
Yes, sir, he said you specifically.
So that's Greg Palast questioning the Republican candidate for governor, Brian Kemp, who's the Secretary of State. Greg Palast, the journalist who's been investigating Kemp and voter suppression in Georgia, director of the 2016 documentary titled The Best Democracy Money Can Buy. You are suing Brian Kemp as well, Greg Palast. Explain what you found and why you're suing him.
Well, you see, he wouldn't answer my questions, so he's going to have to answer them in a federal court. This is a follow-up to my Rolling Stone 2016 investigation. We are suing him, and I say we, including civil rights organizations, to find out why he's removed 340,134 Georgians on supposed evidence that they've left the state or left their county, and they are still in their home registration addresses. They haven't left. So you're talking 1/3 people. If these people show up to vote on November 6th, they're going to find that they can't vote. They'll be handed a provisional ballot, but it won't be counted. This is huge. And these lists are violently racially prejudiced. So we are going into court to get all the answers why he did this. We know it's wrong. And from my other investigations, I was able to get inside his operation and get some of the purge lists before. It's quite an ugly operation. I've never seen a purge operation this wide, this big. And this one thing that Stacey Abrams was mentioning during the debate, it's not just the 53,000 names pending, it's the 340,000 people purged. That is, their registrations have been canceled. That's why we're in court with the voting rights groups to get the information on exactly why these people were wrongly removed.
And Greg, you are a veteran of this issue of voter suppression in various national elections. I think back to Katherine Harris in Florida during the infamous Florida recount vote and the purging of supposed felons from the Florida voting list. Kenneth Blackwell, another Republican Secretary of State in Ohio during the 2004 elections. We've heard about Chris Kobach in Kansas, and now Kemp in Georgia. This Secretary of State position rarely gets a lot of attention, but when it comes to election time, it's a key position, isn't it?
Well, that's one thing that's not very well understood. It's very, very dangerous for Brian Kemp to be in charge of the vote while he's running for governor. As you see, for example, Chris Kobach, also Secretary of State, and you've got another story coming up, is closing and moving polling stations where voters of color can't get to those stations. Kemp is doing the same thing, by the way. He's closed stations in neighborhoods of voters of color in Atlanta, for example, in the 6th Georgia congressional district. He will be the one, when people go to the polling stations and find they've been purged and they fill out those provisional ballots, it'll be Brian Kemp who decides whether they get counted. Absentee ballots. You just heard how panicked he was about the massive number of absentee ballots coming in from voters of color, from Democrats, and he's going to be able to decide which of those ballots get counted. People don't realize you mail in your ballot, you're kind of taking a chance. They have to decide that your signature is correct. In Georgia, Kemp has imposed a rule called exact match. You add your middle initial and you didn't register that way, or you leave it out and you did register that way, your ballot is toast. It's gone. This is very serious to let a Secretary of State, the ballot counter, the guy who determines who gets the vote, which ballots get counted, where the vote takes place, how it takes place. Secretary of State Kemp is not following the normal procedure that a Secretary of State should resign while they're running for governor.
So let's go back to Tuesday night's gubernatorial debate in Georgia. This is the Republican candidate, Brian Kemp, questioning Democratic candidate Stacey Abrams.
In a recent video, you called on illegals to vote for you in this election. I was actually shocked. I had to watch that video twice. It clearly shows that you are asking for undocumented and documented folks to be part of your winning strategy. So my question is, why are you encouraging people to break the law for you in this election?
Mr. Kemp, you are very aware that I know the laws of Georgia when it comes to voting. In fact, I am one of the foremost experts in the state on expansion of voting rights. And I have never in my life asked for anyone who is not legally eligible to vote to be able to cast a ballot. What I've asked for is that you allow those who are legally eligible to vote to allow them to cast their ballots. And in fact, we took you to court in 2016, and a federal judge said that you illegally canceled 34,000 registrations. You used the exact same system, the exact match system that is under dispute right now. Now, I realize that in the next response, you're going to say that it's a function of my organization because your tendency is to blame everyone else for the mistakes that you make. My responsibility as a leader is to see a problem and try to solve it. When I saw that we had 800,000 unregistered people of color in the state of Georgia, I started an organization that has reached into every county and increased those registrations. When I saw that people were being unlawfully denied the right to vote, I worked to make certain that we held you accountable. And as the next governor of Georgia, I will continue to do my job to make certain that every legally eligible vote that gets cast gets counted.
We're going to return to Leah Wright Rigueur on this answer. Leah Wright Rigueur, author, Harvard professor at the Kennedy School of Government. Can you respond to the accusation and what Stacey Abrams said?
Well, I think Stacey Abrams is laying out her pathway to the governor's office and to victory, but she's doing it in such a way as to remind everyone that she's interested in a legal pathway, but that also she is interested in expanding the rights and the constitutionality and the right to vote for all Georgians and ensuring that they have that right to vote. So for a long time, in our democracy, and it's not just Georgia, there's been this idea that everyone should have the right to vote, but it's coexisted with this idea that not everyone should have the right to vote. And in fact, this is what we've seen, a restriction of rights, of the right to vote for certain groups of people. Abrams was directly responding to that by saying, this has been my ground game, this has been my life's work to ensure that everyone who is a legal citizen has the right to vote and has the right to exercise that vote, as opposed to constraining it. So clearly pointing out that, and rebutting this idea that she's on tape encouraging undocumented peoples to vote, but instead saying this is about ensuring that citizens have their right to vote and are able to exercise that right, as opposed to being suppressed or losing those rights.
Well, during Tuesday's debate, Stacey Abrams was also asked about a 1992 protest she took part in when she was photographed burning the Georgia state flag.
And 26 years ago, as a college freshman, I, along with many other Georgians, including the governor of Georgia, were deeply disturbed by the racial divisiveness that was embedded in the state flag with that Confederate symbol. I took an action of peaceful protest. I said that that was wrong. And 10 years later, my opponent, Brian Kemp, actually voted to remove that symbol.
Leah Wright Rigueur, your reaction to this issue being raised in the waning days of this election?
This is a tight and close and contested election. This is a monumental election. A black woman has received the Democratic nomination for a gubernatorial bid, which is a first. It's also a touchstone for the rest of the nation in terms of issues like democratic politics, blue wave, progressive politics, black women in politics and their effect. And so, of course, in the closing days of the election, all of these so-called controversies are going to erupt. Now, for the Abrams campaign, they in some ways anticipated this. What Stacey Abrams did in 1992 is in no way illegal. It is her constitutional right, as stated, an exercise of free speech, but also supported by the several Supreme Court rulings. But also, at the time, we're not talking about the Georgia state flag. We're talking about the segregationist version of the Georgia state flag, which the then governor of Georgia was trying trying to get rid of, and later Kemp would also push to get rid of. So this is actually a non-controversy, if anything. And so the Abrams camp has actually done quite a good job as this has erupted of saying, no, this is not what it seems. And in fact, this was about making Georgia more democratic, more fair, and less racist for citizens of the entire state.
In fact, Stacey Abrams has very proudly said in her response that she stands by what she did. She doesn't consider this an expose, that action helped to lead to the removal of that version of the Georgia flag that was largely the Confederate flag.
Absolutely. And, you know, if this is the biggest controversy that Abrams is facing, then, I mean, what do you have? This woman is squeaky clean. She is fighting for the rights of, you know, for democratic rights, for the expansion of enfranchisement for legal citizens. So the idea that, you know, that she would be burning a flag, oh, shocker. But in turn, it turns out that the flag that she was burning was an unjust flag, that was a segregationist flag, that, you know, generally the political class in Georgia was united around getting rid of. So this is, again, this is a non-starter, but it's emerging at a point in time as one of these things that is designed to disrupt and really rile antagonism against Stacey Abrams, and perhaps encourage turnout from Kemp's base as a way of holding back, you know, Stacey Abrams in a really contentious fight.
So let's go to a larger picture right now, which is what President Trump has said in the last few days and doubled down yesterday. At a rally in Houston, he officially declared himself a nationalist, tagging himself with the label that has long been aligned with Nazism and white nationalism, clearly something he was indicating he knew in this clip.
A globalist is a person that wants the globe to do well, frankly, not caring about our country so much. And you know what? We can't have that. You know, they have a word. It sort of became old-fashioned. It's called a nationalist. And I say, really, we're not supposed to use that word. You know what I am? I'm a nationalist, okay? I'm a nationalist.
So that was Trump on Monday night, and then he doubled down on the nationalist label when speaking to the press at the White House.
There is a concern that you are sending coded language or a dog whistle to some Americans out there that what you really mean is that you're a white nationalist.
I've never even heard that. I cannot imagine that. You mean, I say I'm a nationalist? No, I never heard that theory about being a nationalist. I've heard them all. But I'm somebody that loves our country.
I'm somebody that loves our country. Professor Leah Wright-Rigueur, can you respond to what President Trump has said this week, labeling himself a proud nationalist?
It's an interesting choice of words, given that he could have used patriot as for somebody who loves their country, but instead doubled down on this idea of nationalism. It's not the first time that he's done it. During the 2016 campaign, he labeled himself a nationalist. Steve Bannon was behind this, but also it was very much an embrace of Steve Bannon's idea of nationalism. Regardless of, you know, he may say this is not ethnic nationalism, this is not white nationalism. It is sending a very distinct message and drawing on a very distinct message at a point in time where nationalism is on the rise in the country, but so is, you know, violence around nationalism, ethnic nationalism, white nationalism. So in a way, this is drawing back on that 2016 strategy, which was quite effective for him, which is a rallying cry to all of these people around the country, this base that put him in office, that elected him at a time when in the midterms where he's really pushing a culture war strategy and reviving a culture war strategy because there's not much else to go on. So it's worked for him in the past. It's his calling card, and here here he is reviving it. The other interesting point is that he's reviving it at a moment where Steve Bannon is no longer officially associated with with the White House, with the Trump administration. So it does tell you that those ties are still there, but so is that ideology that's pulling through. It's a message, again, to the base that I'm here for you, I stand for you, I support your agenda. It's also a warning for those outside, in a way of alienating other people as outsiders. And it's Donald Trump's way of saying, I'm president of these people, but not those people.
And this all comes as the Florida gubernatorial candidate, the Democrat Andrew Gillum, was targeted by a racist robocall paid for by a white supremacist group. Gillum aiming to be Florida's first black governor. This is a clip of the robocall, a real warning. It is extremely racist.
Well, hello there. I is Andrew Gillum, and I'll be the mayor of Tallahassee.
And this is the gubernatorial candidate, Tallahassee Mayor Andrew Gillum, responding to these racist robocalls on CNN.
I want to make sure that we don't racialize and, frankly, weaponize race as a part of this process, which is why I've called on my opponent to really work to rise above some of these things. People are taking their cues from him, from his campaign, and from Donald Trump.
And we should.
And we saw in Charlottesville that can lead to real, frankly, dangerous outcomes.
Leah Wright-Rigueur, your final comment on the climate right now.
Well, these are races that are indicative of a much broader and, in some ways, much more dangerous climate that really ties back to the Trump administration and the emergence of, really the emergence of a much broader identity that is tied to nationalism or racialized nationalism. But the other thing that's going on here is that we have a set of candidates that are running against people that have wholly tied themselves to Donald Trump, proudly tied themselves to Donald Trump and Donald Trump's agenda. So really what we're gearing up for is a showdown between, does the Trump effect still stand? This one way of approaching politics, this exclusionary way of approaching national politics and local and state politics, or is there another way? Is there a way that is built on alliances and coalitions that is inclusive and is about expanding the boundaries of democracy so that all American citizens count?
We want to thank you for being with us. Leah Wright-Rigueur, professor at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. She's the author of The Loneliness of the Black Republican, Pragmatic Politics and the Pursuit of Power. Greg Palast, journalist who's been investigating Georgia Secretary of State Brian Kemp, who's running for governor on the Republican ticket, been looking overall at voter suppression in Georgia. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, what's happening in Dodge? That's Dodge, Kansas. And how are U.S. corporations profiting from ICE? Stay with us.
Took a picture that I'll have to send. People here are friendly and content. People here are colorful and bright. The flowers often bloom at night. Amanita is the name. The flowers.
The Flowers of Guatemala, from the soundtrack to Finding Oscar. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
Well, in Kansas, local officials are under fire for moving a majority Latino city's single polling site outside of the city limits, more than a mile from the nearest bus stop. Dodge City, Kansas is nearly 60% Hispanic, but the Associated Press reports that Hispanic turnout in the county where Dodge City is located was just 17%, compared to 61% turnout for white voters in 2014.
The ACLU reports Dodge's lone polling site services more than 13,000 voters, compared to an average of 1,200 voters per polling site in other locations. We're joined now by Johnny Dunlap with the Kansas Democratic Party. He's joining us from Dodge City. Welcome to Democracy Now! Tell us what happened.
Well, so this is really one more thing in a larger, longer problem. Way back in 2002, the county clerk went down to just one polling place for Dodge City, Kansas, and it's been that way since. And that one polling place was in the more affluent white part of town. And Dodge City is pretty clearly divided between like a white northern part of town and a Hispanic southern part of town. So this move of the polling location is really just taking a already bad situation and making it worse, because it's moved the polling location outside of town, so it's convenient for no one. And when you combine that with a historic turnout of 17% for the Hispanic population, a 61% turnout for the white population, and then you look at our elected officials, every seat we have, except for the county commission, is at large. So our city commission, our school board, our community college board of trustees, every one of those offices are currently held by a white person, even though the town is 60% Hispanic. So this move is just, like I said, it's just one more thing in an ongoing problem.
And Johnny Dunlap, I'd like to ask you, because most people are not aware that a place, an iconic place like Dodge City, famed in the westward movement of Americans, has such a high Latino population. But it's not the only place in the Midwest. Throughout Iowa and Kansas and Nebraska, there's been a huge surge in the last 20 years or so of Latino populations, mostly as a result of the importation of Mexican labor for the meatpacking industry. Could you talk about that?
Sure. So in Dodge City specifically, that influx began in the late 70s, early 1980s. There are now two large beef packing plants in Dodge City. It's one of the cornerstones of our economy around here. And those beef packing plants have historically recruited folks from points south to come here and live and work. And so what we have now is second, third generation Americans who have only ever voted in one polling place and don't know that it could be better.
And what's the reason that the city clerk gives for the lone polling place? Forget about the fact that it's already overburdened given the voting population, but then moving it outside of the city limits to a place where you can't even get there by public transportation?
Well, so it's the county clerk. The county clerk, I met with her in May, late May, to ask her to increase the number of polling places. And this is not the first time I've met with our county clerk, and her predecessor I met with several times in an effort to convince them to have more polling places. And the excuses that she gives for only having one polling place, frankly, don't hold water. I mean, one of them is she said, well, it would increase cost to have more polling places, and it's just not in my budget. Well, the thing is, she writes her own budget. So if something is not in her budget, it's because she didn't put it in her budget. And then she complains about the number of voting machines that she has. And the thing is, she has enough machines to cover the polling place. With a 13,000 voter burden, you could take some of those machines and split them out to other sites, and you would still have enough voting machines.
Does it have anything to do with who the Secretary of State is, Chris Kobach? And now he's running for governor, the man who led the now defunct, disgraced so-called Voter Integrity Commission for Trump. And even in the Trump administration, they had to get rid of it. Now Chris Kobach running for governor against Democrat Laura Kelly.
Well, so yeah, the thing is, the Secretary of State has to has the power to stop something like this and approves it. So for the last 8 years, Chris Kobach has signed off on one polling place in Dodge City, Kansas. And really, this is part of a larger narrative for him. I mean, he passed, we passed in Kansas bills that he championed and wrote that have since been declared unconstitutional because they disenfranchised voters. And on the ground in Dodge City, that's made things difficult. Like we've attempted to have voting drives and things. Voter registration drives in Dodge City. And before Chris Kobach's voter ID law, which required citizens to prove their citizenship, so it reversed the burden of proof from the government to the citizen, and so folks would register to vote, and then they'd have to go to the county clerk and present their birth certificate or some sort of proof of citizenship. And so what happened in these voter registration drives is that, you know, folks would start filling out the form, and then we would say, okay, well, now you need to take this to the county clerk along with your birth certificate, and then you'll be registered to vote. And they would be in shock and angry, and some of them even like tore up their voter registration card and said, no, forget about it. This is too much. So it's just this thing in Dodge City this year is, again, I think part of a larger problem where the Republican Party in Kansas has taken a lot of steps to make voting more difficult, to put obstacles in the way of people registering, of people getting to the polls. It's a bigger problem.
Johnny Dunlap, I want to thank you for being with us, chair of the Ford County, Kansas Democratic Party, as we move on to our next segment.
Well, we end today's show looking at a shocking new report titled "Who's Behind ICE? The Tech and Data Companies Fueling Deportations." The new report by Mi Gente, the National Immigration Project, and the Immigrant Defense Project details how corporations like Amazon, Palantir, and Microsoft are profiting from and expediting President Trump's incarceration and deportation operations. Currently, about 10% of the Department of Homeland Security's $44 billion budget is dedicated to data management. The report is being published as new documents obtained by the Project on Government Oversight show that Amazon is pushing the U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement to start using its controversial facial recognition technology that could identify immigrants in real time by scanning faces in a video feed.
For more, we go to Phoenix, Arizona, where we're joined by Jacinta Gonzalez, an organizer with Mi Gente, a national political hub for Latinx organizing, which co-wrote the Who's Behind ICE report. Jacinta, tell us what you found.
Good morning, Amy. Thank you so much for having us. You know, what we really found in this report is understanding that the tech industry, Silicon Valley, is really changing the way we see immigration and customs enforcement on the ground. We've been seeing for a while added capabilities to be able to surveil people, be able to input new sources of data, including private sources like medical bills, different records from different companies. Even your phone bill, for example, is getting into these records. And that's how immigration is able to conduct their raids and go door to door, terrorizing communities and really impacting families every day that are devastated by their separations. And so what was really revealed in this report is that there's tech industries, private companies that are helping create these programs for ICE, but also other tech companies like Amazon, for example, are expanding their budget by basically being able to offer cloud services to the government.
Yeah, and could you talk about this, the disproportionate impact that Amazon now has on cloud services for government agencies?
You know, back in 2010, Amazon and many other tech companies began to lobby the government to say that you should have cloud services to be able to digitize all of your files. And what they basically did was ensure a very, very lucrative contract. To be able to store information for the government, you have to have FedRAMP authorizations. It's their way of being able to say that you're able to hold information for the government. And Amazon has 204 authorizations, compared to other companies like Google that have less than 30. And so we really see that Amazon has been monopolizing this industry and making sure that they're profiting tremendously off of both war and the war on immigrants and home.
Talk more about the individual companies that you found and who's funding ICE, who is backing up, who's profiting from the deportation system that's going on now.
One of the primary companies that we identified was a company named Palantir. And Palantir was literally founded by money that was invested from the CIA and Peter Thiel, who many of us know is a strong supporter of Mr. Trump, to create this company that would be able to do data processing, data mining, has been involved in multiple international scandals, including Cambridge Analytica, and is basically creating the backbone of ICE. It is creating the investigative case management system that ICE uses to be able to track immigrants, to be able to surveil them, and finally organize their deportation. But what we're seeing is that Palantir is able to develop this technology to attack immigrants, yet somehow whenever they separate children from their parents at the border, they lose track of them and aren't able to find out where they are. So we really are able to see through these technologies what they're prioritizing, but also who is behind this. It's the CIA, it's Peter Thiel, it's business interests that are trying to expand Trump's agenda.
One of the things I think your report talks about is the pushback that many of these tech companies have gotten from their own employees who do not feel comfortable with their companies taking such a huge role in things like ICE and other government storage projects. Could you talk about that as well, and how Amazon is distinct even in this area?
Yes, I think one of the things that has been exciting is even though we see other companies come up and make millions of dollars, billions of dollars off of immigration and custom enforcement, we also see workers within these companies with a conscience raising up and saying, we're not okay with this. We're organizing against our employers, and we have a right to speak about what we're helping to build. And so we've seen exciting movements happen within corporations that are having workers sign petitions, talk to their CEOs, talk to people who have the power to make these decisions. We've seen it inside of companies like Salesforce. We've seen it inside of companies like Amazon. We've heard rumors of it actually even happening within Palantir. And so we actually really want to encourage workers who are trying to organize, who are trying to have some sort of voice in this, because we know that these are not times to be neutral. No one, we are very clear on what the Trump agenda is, Jeff Sessions' agenda. They want to attack, they want to incarcerate, they want to deport. And so it is up to us to decide what our response is going to be. And we really want to make sure that people are not being compliant, not compliant inside of the companies that are helping set up these infrastructures, and not compliant with the racist enforcement regime that is being imposed. But we have ways of changing it.
Can you talk about the sharing of biometric information with the Mexican government, these corporations doing that, Jacinta?
Yeah, so there's many companies like DevTech Technologies that are actually developing technology and have contracts in Mexico to be sharing data. And so we see it on some levels inside of the Mexicans Institute of Immigration, sharing information, but we've seen even more concerning contracts where there's trying to share information that's coming from voter records in Mexico, the voter ID cards, being able to share that information. And so we see through the Plan Mérida, Plan Frontera Sur, other militarization programs that the U.S. has been imposing in Mexico, they've been investing also millions and billions of dollars into the development of technology to be able to track and control migrants. And that's what's leading the crisis that we have now. Instead of investing in things that will allow governments to be able to provide for their communities, for people to be able to live dignified lives in their home countries, we see the U.S. intervening in politics, investing in militarization, which just creates more instability and forces people to migrate.
And Jacinta, we have only about a minute left, but I wanted to ask you about a New York Times story published recently called Silicon Valley's Saudi Arabia problem, in light of what's been going on in terms of the assassination of a journalist by the Saudi government. This whole issue of Saudi Arabia investing heavily in Silicon Valley through the Japanese company SoftBank.
Yep. I mean, what we're seeing now more than ever is we have corporations in Silicon Valley and other places in the world that are amassing more power, more money, more information than anyone else has. I mean, Amazon at this point literally knows what your favorite type of blender is and is holding your entire police file. We have to be able to have more accountability from these corporations. We need to be able to ensure that they are respecting basic human rights. And if the government isn't willing to step up to do it, we know that workers inside are going to be able to organize, and also the general public is able to push back on them. But we know that more and more corporations are starting to influence international politics.
Jacinta Gonzalez, welcome. Thank you very much for being with us with the group Mi Gente. That does it for today's broadcast. I'll be speaking tonight in Aliso Viejo in Orange County, California at Soka University. Check our website. Juan Gonzalez will be speaking at Rutgers on Friday night with Oscar Lopez Rivera. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.